Morning, and welcome to this event on EU-China relations with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Welcome. I'm very glad to have you here. I'm Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive of the EPC, and it's my pleasure to co-host this event together with MERICS and Mikko Huotari. We at the EPC believe that cooperation between think tanks is very important, and that together we can increase the impact of what we think tanks do. So it's my pleasure to be able to work together for this seminal speech on EU-China relations. We truly live in a new era after the watershed moment of Russia's invasion, after all the global changes we have seen. And in the latest iteration of this perma-crisis, as we at EPC have called it, clearly the role of China is very important. It's very important to see how the global era is developing. The geopolitical commission is going to deal with an important country like China. So we are looking very much forward to the speech and the discussion which then will follow. And I'll hand over to Mikko to say a couple of words as well.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Fabian, a warm welcome also on behalf of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERICS. My name is Mikko Huotari, I'm the Executive Director of this institute. We're very grateful for the opportunity to host this extremely important event and partner with EPC. I think it's a good expression of our cooperation in the past years. Our mission at MERICS is getting China right, providing the best possible China analysis on developments in China, outside China, and on this most consequential relationship for the EU. We're grateful for the support of the Commission that has invested in independent knowledge on China over the past years, and we're very grateful for the support of our foundation and the partners and the members of our institute. And with that, I think I would like to hand over to the President for her speech, and we very much look forward to your introduction and then later to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here at this very special event, co-hosted by two of Europe's most knowledgeable and independent-minded think tanks. In a time when global affairs are becoming harder to decrypt, and in an era where facts are routinely challenged, the work that you do at these think tanks has never been more important for Europe. Because it is only by having a deeper understanding of the world as it really is, not as we may wish it to be, that we can develop better informed policies. And this is why I believe think tanks are an essential part of our democracy. In just 10 years, MERICS has developed a unique expertise in analyzing the political, economic, and social trends in China and how these impact Europe and the world. And we must preserve and uphold your right, and that of all think tanks, to be analytical and to be critical. So I want to express my solidarity with you and all the other individuals and institutions who have been unfairly sanctioned by the Chinese government. I would also like to congratulate the European Policy Center on its recent 25th anniversary. From the outset, you have been a truly European voice in the world of policy and academia. This spirit is very much in the image of one of your founders and one of Europe's most unheralded fathers, Max Kronstamm. Max Kronstamm lived through personal trauma and tragedy during World War II. And this experience inspired him to dedicate his life to building a united Europe. One question always guided his work, and I quote, Do we believe that states are forever condemned to remain, never to trust another state? Or do we believe in the possibility of change, of gradually changing men's minds and their behavior? End of quote. This commitment to creating a better understanding between people lives on through Europe's think tank community. And it is this need to deepen our knowledge of a rapidly changing world that brings us here to discuss Europe's policy towards China. Our relationship with China is one of the most intricate and important anywhere in the world. And how we manage it will be a determining factor. A factor for our future economic prosperity and national security. China is a nation with a unique history, dating back from early civilization through the rise and fall of dynasties. Its philosophers have shaped culture and society in much of today's world. From Lao Tzu's teaching about living in harmony with nature, to the ethical values of Confucius. The four great inventions of ancient China, the compass, gunpowder, papermaking, and printing, revolutionized world civilization. But this latest era is in many ways one of the most remarkable chapters in that long, winding, and often turbulent history. In less than 50 years, China has moved from widespread poverty and economic isolation to be the world's second largest economy and a leader in many cutting-edge technologies. Since 1978, growth has averaged over 9% per year, and more than 800 million people were lifted out of poverty. This is one of the greatest accomplishments of the past half-century. China's reach stretches across all continents and global institutions, and its ambitions are far greater still. Through the Belt and Road initiatives, it is the largest lender to developing countries. And its economic, industrial, and military power puts into question any notion of China itself being still a developing country. We heard that last October when President Xi told the Communist Party Congress that by 2049, he wanted China to become a world leader in, and I quote, composite national strength and international influence, end of quote. Or to put it in simpler terms, he essentially wants China to become the world's most powerful nation. Given its size and global influence, it is positive that China's economy has eventually reopened after COVID. And it is good that our citizens, businesses, and diplomats are able to exchange once again. Because understanding each other starts with speaking with one another. But at the same time, we are concerned by what is behind this return to global stage, defining a European strategy towards China, defining what success looks like, must start with a sober assessment of our current relations and of China's strategic intentions. Our relationship with China is far too important to be put at risk by failing to clearly set the terms of a healthy engagement. It is clear that our relations have become more distant and more difficult in the last few years. We've seen a very deliberate hardening of China's overall strategic posture for some time. And it has now been matched by a ratcheting up of increasingly assertive actions. There was a stark reminder of that last week in Moscow during President Xi's state visit. Far from being put off by the atrocious and illegal invasion of Ukraine, President Xi is maintaining his no limits friendship with Putin. But there has been a change of dynamic in the relationship between China and Russia. It is clear from this visit that China sees Putin's weakness as a way to increase its leverage over Russia. And it is clear that the power balance in that relationship, which for most of the last century favored Russia, has now reversed. Most telling were President Xi's parting words to Putin on the steps outside the Kremlin when he said, and I quote, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. And we are the ones driving these changes together." End of quote. As a permanent member of the Security Council, China has a responsibility to safeguard the principles and values that lie at the heart of the UN Charter. And China has a responsibility to play a constructive role in advancing a just peace. But that peace can only be just if it is based on upholding the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine will define the terms of a just peace that requires the withdrawal of invading troops. Any peace plan which would in effect consolidate Russian annexations is simply not a viable plan. We have to be frank on this point. How China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for EU-China relations going forward. And of course, China itself has also taken a more assertive stance in its own neighborhood. The show of military force in the South China Sea and East China Sea and at the border with India directly affect our partners and their legitimate interests. We also underscore the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Any weakening of regional stability in Asia, the fastest growing region in the world, affects global security, the free flow of trade, and our own interests in the region. The grave human rights violations occurring in Xinjiang are also a cause of great concern, as laid out in the recent report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. How China meets international obligation regarding human rights will be another test for how and how much we can cooperate with China. Just as China has been ramping up its military posture, it has also ramped up its policies of disinformation and economic and trade coercion. This is a deliberate policy targeting other countries to ensure they comply and conform. We saw it when China responded to the opening of a Taiwan office in Vilnius by taking retaliatory measures against Lithuania and other European companies. We have seen it with popular boycotts against clothing brands, or speaking out on human rights, or with sanctions against members of the European Parliament, officials, and academic institutions, or their take on China's actions. We've seen that member states increasingly have to deal with Chinese activities in their societies, which are not tolerable. And we have seen it in the region, for example, when China severely restricted Australian exports of barley and wine because of its government's questions on the origin of COVID. This is all part of a deliberate use of dependencies and economic leverage to ensure that China gets what it wants from smaller countries. Ladies and gentlemen, these escalatory actions point to a China that is becoming more repressive at home and more assertive abroad. There are three broad conclusions we can draw on how China is changing, which in turn must shape how our policies will need to change too. The first is that China has now turned the page on the area of reform and opening and is moving into a new era of security and control. We saw this earlier this month when President Xi repeated his pledge to make the Chinese military, and I quote, "a great wall of steel that effectively safeguards national sovereignty, security, and development interests," end of quote. We saw it with Beijing's Global Security Initiative, which it seeks to embed in UN documents and international discourse more widely. We can expect to see a greater focus on security, whether military, tech, or economic. All companies in China, for example, are already obliged by law to assist state intelligence gathering operations and to keep it secret. We can also expect even stricter economic control measures as part of a strengthening of the Chinese Communist Party's steering of the economy through its institutions and leaders. And we can expect to see a clear path and push to make China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. Or as President Xi put it bluntly a few years ago, and I quote, "China must tighten international production chains' dependence on China to form a powerful countermeasure and deterrent capability," end of quote. This is especially true when it comes to critical raw materials like lithium or cobalt, for sectors like high-speed rail and renewable energy technology, or for emerging tech that is central to future economic and national security, like quantum computing or robotics and artificial intelligence. The second conclusion we can draw flows from this, and that is that the imperative for security and control now trumps the logic of free markets and open trade. In his report to the recent Party Congress, President Xi told the Chinese people to prepare for struggle. And it is no coincidence that he used in his opening speech the words "dozen" and "fendo" repeatedly, which both can be translated as struggle. This is indicative of a worldview shaped by a sense of mission for the Chinese nation. Which brings me to the third conclusion. And that is that the Chinese Communist Party's clear goal is a systemic change of the international order with China at its center. We have seen it with China's positions in multilateral bodies, which show its determination to promote an alternative vision of the world order. One where individual rights are subordinated to national security, where security and economy take prominence over political and civil rights. We've seen it with the Belt and Road Initiative, new international banks or other China-led institutions set up to rival the current international system. We've seen it with China's set of global initiatives and by how it positions itself as a power and peace broker, for instance, through the recent Saudi Arabia and Iran agreement. And we have seen the show of friendship in Moscow, which says 1,000 words about this new vision for an international order. Ladies and gentlemen, with all this in mind, our response must start by working to strengthening the international system itself. We want to work with our partners on global issues like trade, finance, climate, sustainable development, or health. For that, we need to reinforce the institutions and systems in which countries can compete and cooperate and from which they benefit. This is why it is vitally important that we ensure diplomatic stability and open communication with China. I believe it is neither viable nor in Europe's interest to decouple from China. Our relations are not black or white, and our response cannot be either. And this is why we need to focus on de-risk, not decouple. And this is part of the reason why I will soon be visiting Beijing together with President Macron. Managing this relationship and having an open and frank exchange with our Chinese counterparts is a key part of what I would call the de-risking through diplomacy of our relations with China. We will never be shy in raising the deeply concerning issues I've already set out. But I believe we must leave space for discussion on a more ambitious partnership and on how we can make competition fairer and more disciplined. And more broadly, we need to think about how we can work together productively in the global system in the future and on which challenges. There are some islands of opportunity that we can build on. Take climate change and nature protection. I very much welcome the leading role China played in securing the historic Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Agreement. And a few weeks ago, China was also an active player in the global deal to protect biodiversity in international waters. At a time of global conflict and tensions, these are notable diplomatic achievements, which China and the European Union worked on together. And we look forward to working together in the same spirit ahead of COP28 later this year. And this shows what can be done when interests align. And it shows that diplomacy can still work whether on pandemic preparedness, nuclear non-proliferation, or global financial stability. The point here is that we do not want to cut economic, societal, political, or scientific ties. China is a vital trading partner, accounting for 9% of our goods exports and more than 20% of our goods imports. While imbalances are growing, most of our trade in goods and services remains mutual beneficial and unrisky. But our relationship is unbalanced and increasingly affected by distortions created by China's state capitalist system. So we need to rebalance this relationship on the basis of transparency, predictability, and reciprocity. We have to ensure that our trade and investment relations promote prosperity in China and in the European Union. The Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the so-called KAI, for which negotiations concluded in 2020, aimed at such rebalancing. But we have to recognize that the world and China have changed significantly in the last 3 years. And we need to reassess the KAI in light of our wider China strategy. And we know there are some areas where trade and investment poses risks to our economic and national security, particularly in the context of China's explicit fusion of its military and commercial sectors. This is true for certain sensitive technologies, dual-use goods, or even investment which comes with forced technology or knowledge transfers. This is why, after de-risking through diplomacy, the second strand of our future China strategy must be economic de-risking. The starting point for this is having a clear-eyed picture on what the risks are. That means recognizing how China's economic and security ambitions have shifted. But it also means taking a critical look at our own resilience and dependencies, in particular within our industrial and defense space. This can only be based on stress testing our relationship to see where the greatest threats lie concerning our resilience, long-term prosperity and security. And this will allow us to develop our economic de-risking strategy across 4 pillars. The first one is making our own economy and industry more competitive and resilient. This is particularly the case when it comes to health, digital, and the clean tech sector. If you look at the global market for net zero technologies, it is set to triple by 2030, triple. Our ability to remain front runners in this sector will shape our economy for the decades to come. And this is why, you all know it, just last week we put forward the Net Zero Industry Act as a key part of our Green Deal industrial plan. The aim is to be able to produce at least 40% of the clean tech that we need for the green transition, such as solar, onshore and offshore wind, renewable energy in the broadest sense, batteries and storage, heat pumps and grid technologies. But to achieve this goal, we will also need more independence and diversity when it comes to the key inputs needed for our competitiveness. We know this is an era where we rely on one single supplier, China, for 98% of our rare earth supply, 93% of our magnesium, 97% of our lithium, just to name a few. We are deeply mindful of what happened with Japan's imports of rare earths from China a decade ago, when foreign policy tensions between the two in the East China Sea became acute. Our demand for these materials will skyrocket as the digital and the green transition speed up. Batteries that are powering our electric vehicles are forecasted to drive up demand for lithium by 17 times by 2050. This is why we have put forward the Critical Raw Materials Act to help diversify and secure our supply. And we need to think about this right across our single market to strengthen our resilience on cyber and maritime, space and digital, defense and innovation. The second part of this de-risking strategy is better using our existing toolbox of trade instruments. Over the past years, we've put in place measures to address security concerns, whether on 5G, the foreign direct investment, or export controls. We have given ourselves the tools to counter economic distortions, notably through the foreign subsidies regulation, as well as the new instrument to deter economic coercion. We now need the unity at EU level for bolder and faster use of those instruments when they are required, and a more assertive approach to enforcement. My third point. China's changing policies may require us to develop new defensive tools for some critical sectors. The European Union needs to define its future relationship with China and other countries in sensitive, high-tech areas, such as microelectronics, quantum computing, robotics, artificial intelligence, biotech, you name it. Where dual-use purposes cannot be excluded or human rights might be implicated, there will need to be a clear line on whether investments or exports are in our own security interest. We need to ensure that our companies' capital, expertise, and knowledge are not used to enhance the military and intelligence capabilities of those who are also systemic rivals. So we have to look at where there are gaps in our toolbox, which allow the leakage of emerging and sensitive technologies through investments in other countries. And this is why we're currently reflecting on if and how Europe should develop a targeted instrument on outbound investment. This would relate to a small number of sensitive technologies where investment can lead to the development of military capabilities that pose risks to national security. The Commission will present some initial ideas as part of our new economic security strategy later this year. This will map out where we need to strengthen our economic security and how to better use our trade and tech security tools. The fourth part of our economic de-risking strategy is alignment with other partners. On issues that concern our economic security, we have much in common with our partners around the world. This is especially true to our G7 and G20 partners, and those in the region and beyond who are often more integrated with China and more advanced in their thinking on de-risking. As part of this, we will focus on free trade agreements where we do not yet have them, such as with New Zealand, Australia, India, our ASEAN and Mercosur partners, on modernizing agreements where we have them, such as Mexico and Chile, and on better using the others that already exist. We will enhance cooperation on sectors such as digital and clean tech through the Trade and Technology Council with India or the EU-Japan Green Alliance. And we will invest in infrastructure in the region and beyond through the Global Gateway Strategy. We are offering developing countries a genuine choice when it comes to infrastructure, investment, and finance. And all of this will help strengthen our supply chain resilience and diversify our trade, which must be a central element of our economic de-risking strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, we have in front of us a task to refocus on the most important issues. And it is a reflection of the need to adjust our strategy in line with the way the Chinese Communist Party seems to be changing. But if we are to manage this relationship, to prepare for the future, we must do it together. At this defining moment in global affairs, we need the collective will to respond together. A strong European-China policy relies on strong coordination between member states and EU institutions, and a willingness to avoid the divide and conquer tactics that we know we may face. But I also want to say that nothing is inevitable in geopolitics. China is fascinating and a complex mix of history, progress, and challenges. And it will define this century. But our story about how we relate to China is not yet fully written. And it need not be a defensive one. We must collectively show that our democratic system, our values, and our open economy can deliver on prosperity and security for people. And at the same time, we must always be ready to talk and work with those who see the world differently. Which brings me back to where I started and Max Kornstam's line about working to gradually change minds and action. This is what you do every single day in your work, and this is what Europe will always believe in. Long live Europe, and many thanks for your attention. Thank you. Dankeschön.
Madam President, thank you so much for your speech, for being with us this morning to share your vision on the future of EU-China relations, for setting the terms for a healthy relationship as you have laid out, and for the de-risking strategy. My name is Elizabeth Kuiper. I'm Associate Director at the European Policy Center, and I'm very honored to indeed moderate a panel that will follow the speech that the Commission President just has given. We have with us Fabian and Mikko, and I'm also very happy to have Francesca Giretti with us, analyst at MERICS Institute. Fabian, I'll start with you because the Commission President spoke about the need for unity, and you and we all at the European Policy Center have been written a lot about the Burma crisis, the need indeed to overcome the ambition unity challenge. So how would you say indeed that you position the EU in all of this, in this perma crisis, as we say?
Well, let me start with saying thank you very much for the speech, and I particularly appreciated the reference to Max Konstam, who I think, as you said, one of the founding fathers of the European Union, but maybe not recognized as much. So very much appreciated that you've highlighted his role also in the founding of the EPC. I think we are living in a perma crisis. We are living in a world which is rapidly changing and changing in a very challenging way for Europe. I think the references we've heard to maintaining our values, to also maintaining European interests in this changing world, I think is very important. But this is going to be very challenging. We see a world where my country first seems to be the guiding motto. We see a world where government intervention, also for strategic reasons, is becoming rather common, not just in relation to China. If we look around the world, we're seeing a world where also global institutions are challenged. And I would say particularly for Europe, this is very difficult because we have very much benefited and relied on those global institutions. All of that together, I think, points to a world where Europe has to do more strategic thinking. And I think that's how I would see the speech, that we are very much in the process of thinking about what are our strategic long-term goals, where do we want to position Europe. But in that, the big question, as you rightly mentioned, is always going to be, are we able to do this together? Will we have the unity? And will we also avoid the ambition unity trap? It's something we have written about before, that sometimes at the European level, when we try to maintain unity, we sacrifice ambition. We sacrifice the need, which we now have, to go much further than we have done in the past. And that's something we can't answer at this moment in time. We are going to see whether we are able, as European countries, to come together and to respond to all of these global challenges, including the issue of China, which has been so eloquently explained today.
Francesca, I also would like to touch on economic security, also based on what the Commission President has said, because in your view, where does the EU stand on EU-China relations today, and how far has the EU come with this agenda in terms of gaps and achievements?
Thank you. I must say that I'm quite pleased to hear the points for the economic security strategy of the European Union that have been just underlined. I think is a great step forward and is the right direction. So my comment will be a little bit more of an elaboration perhaps on these points. And the first one is definitely the importance of a proper risk assessment. Assessing the risk that we have in our bilateral relationship with China and with other countries potentially, of course, and maybe setting up criteria, at least core criteria, to do this exercise recurrently rather than just a one-off. So this is definitely one of the priorities and the existing gaps that I see in the current economic security agenda of the European Union. There's, of course, a dashboard for resilience, which is internal for the European Union, but something a little bit more specific regarding country risks, it would be helpful. The second point that I would want to highlight has already been highlighted, which is we have a great toolbox by now of instruments and measures, and it's about time we think about implementation and how to improve them. Obviously, the anti-coercion instrument is not there quite yet, of course, but we could already think about how do we make it an instrument to coordinate also with other actors globally when we think about economic coercion globally, just rather than just within the European Union. Or, well, this year we have the review of the foreign direct investment screening mechanism. So, looking at the past years and how that can be strengthened and create more cohesion amongst the different systems within the European Union. And then, just finally, the most important point is still going to be about a partnership with third countries. But we have already mentioned how, Global Gateways has developed incredibly in this sense, also thinking about supply chain resilience and agreements specifically in this sector.
Well, thank you so much. And Mikko, also in light of the visit of the Commission President to China, I would like to ask you about the Chinese response to all of this, because China will have to respond. How do you see that China sees the EU in this current geopolitical context, and also taking into account the EU-US relationship?
Well, first of all, we don't know yet how they will respond to this very ambitious strategy. I think we need to expect that they will take it very seriously, which is a good result. They will recognize that there's a moment of convergence inside the European Union that can be built on. Issues around economic security have been discussed today. There's a great alignment of partners, including in the G7 context. The EU is much more efficient now and I think effective in working with global countries in the framework of the G20 and beyond. So I think there's something to take seriously here about our take on China. But I also want to highlight that I think it's quite clear action needs to follow. Because the Chinese leadership considers us to be part of a broader global struggle. And the global ambitions have been outlined quite clearly. We need to match that ambition. And there's no way around our partnerships with the United States and like-minded partners and in the global South. But as EU, on our own terms, we need to define that relationship as much as we can. China will be capable and able to set the terms of its engagement with us, and we have to have our own tools ready and our diplomatic practice adapt and swarm offensive that we're currently facing. And I think there's lots of work to be done, both on the membership level, but also on the European level. And we've seen promising signs over the past years. There's strategies, not just on the European level, but with member states. And I think we need to build that coherence moving forward.
Thank you so much. I now would like to turn to the audience, because we have, I think, 10 minutes for questions and answers to the panel before the Commission President has to leave. So I would like to ask you to state your name and affiliation, and I would like to ask who would like to take the first question. Welcome your way.
Thank you very much. It's working, right? Can we address questions to the panel and also to the president?
You can ask questions to the panel.
Okay. So I will address the questions to the panel, and if anybody else in the room would like to answer, feel free. My question to the panel will be, what would like you to see in this new economic strategy that the president just outlined, and more in particular, what would you like the President von der Leyen and President Macron to, let's say, achieve or address in their meeting with the presidency next week? Thank you.
And is the question for someone particularly, or should I just need to look at you? Who would like to? Mikko, I think you would like to start.
Well, first of all, let's make sure that we present a coherent position of European interest in Beijing and across the visits that are happening. It's not just the President Macron. There's a Spanish PM traveling these days. We will see most likely German officials traveling too. So I think there's a core business that we have to do, which is to make sure that we speak the same language. And it's quite encouraging to see that we now have a good script for that. More specifically, I mean, I can't speak for the French administration. I'm quite sure they have ambitious plans to go back to a solid and mutually beneficial trading relation and investment relationship. And that's right, as the Commission President has just said. Most of our economic engagement with China is absolutely unrisky. And we have to make sure that after 3 years of disengagement, we go back to that. At the same time, I think it will be critical for the President to make clear that we are fully aware of certain new risks that have emerged. I'm quite clear the issues around Taiwan and US-China tensions will also be part of the discussion. And to be clear about where Europe stands on these will be quite critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next? Yes. Please state your name, affiliation before you ask the question, please.
Yes, it's Finbar Birmingham here, a journalist from the South China Morning Post. Question about, again, the trip next week. Do you think that the European Union has given up hope of China playing a mediating role or a constructive role in achieving peace in Ukraine? Thank you.
Fabian?
I think it's very clear that China has put certain things on the table, but we also have to see, as the president has rightly said, what are the pictures we have seen over the last weeks, and in particular the visit to Moscow, which has given I think a rather clear message. And I think from a European perspective, it is clear that peace cannot happen unless the right conditions are met. And the president has outlined that in her speech. But I would still expect that China will continue with its attempts of portraying itself as a balancing factor in the middle. The question really is for us in the collective West, in the broadest sense, of how we respond to that, rather than seeing changes in what China is aiming to do.
I just saw someone else who would like to ask another question. Yes, please. So in front of the audience.
Hello, I'm Pia Gripenberg, Swedish daily Dagens Nyheter. I actually want to ask about TikTok. When countries prohibit TikTok, is it purely a cyber security issue, or is it part of a geopolitical question, relations to US and so on? Can you please have some thoughts around this?
Interesting question. Mikko, would you like to take the challenge?
Look, I think it's part of a broader trend where our digital ecosystems are becoming disentangled, and it has multiple reasons. I think one is simply concerns related to data security, and TikTok has the problems in proving that their technical arrangements are fit for GDPR and other requirements, be it here in Europe or similar concerns in the United States. So I think that's a very legitimate concern that we should be looking at carefully. There's also a broader question to what extent other types of influence, information manipulation, etc., censorship flows over into other jurisdictions and where we have little control over them. So I think this is, again, as I said, legitimate issues that we have to look at in detail, and Chinese companies will be affected by that, as other companies are. And we have to have our standards in place. And I think that's a process that is ongoing at the moment.
One thing to add, I think, and that has already been mentioned, but I think the really important point is coherence. I think that we have to have a clear vision of what we are doing. There have been many questions in the technology field, but what we have not achieved so far is to be as coherent as we should be. And as long as we have very different responses from different countries, then that will always open us also up for the accusation that it's not about security, but it's about other issues. So I think achieving a coherent answer, speaking with one voice on these issues, is extremely important.
I would like to allow for one last question.
Thank you. I just wanted very briefly to ask, the president presented 4 strands on the de-risking, economic de-risking strategy. What are the risks of this de-risking strategy in creating resilience, in enforcement, in closing the gaps of what is missing, and in partnerships? What are the risks?
I think that's one for you, Francesca.
We'll try. I think the first main risk is that you bring it too far, and that is why we often propose this risk assessment. Because if you don't know where you need to de-risk, then maybe you are de-risking in areas where it's absolutely fine to have trade and investments in a relatively free manner. The second one is that in order to boost your own economy, then you end up adopting industrial policies that skew the composition within the industrial composition of the European Union, but also damage some of these sectors where, for example, they might not be high tech, but where we are quite strong. So that is also a risk. And there's also a risk of imbalances between the different member states, right? But this is something that the European Commission has been taking into account for the longest time. And finally, I think there's a risk of, well, since we talked about coherence, a little bit of incoherence. And that is a risk that to which I don't have a solution, but it's more, we talked about boosting the relationship with partner countries, but in these countries, there are also practices that we don't entirely share. How do we approach these countries? Do we bring forward the relationship regardless? Or, you know, we actually adopt a coherent strategy, knowing that in that case, we may bring back much less advantages in terms of supply chain diversification and so on and so forth. So these are the three risks that I would list, amongst many others that probably I'm missing.
I'm sure that we could go on this for much longer, but for now, this is it this morning. So, Madam President, again, I would like to thank you so much for laying out your vision, for indeed setting the scene for your upcoming trip to China, for the de-risking strategy. Again, it was an honor to have you, and of course, we wish you the best of luck for your upcoming trip next week to China. Thank you so much.